When Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez walked onto the Fort Bragg Precision Shooting Range, carrying what looked like a museum piece, the laughter from the other snipers was immediate and merciless. What none of them knew was that the weathered 1944 Springfield M1903, a 4 slung across her shoulder, was about to shatter every assumption they held about modern warfare and rewrite the record books in ways that would leave military historians speechless for decades to come, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning North Carolina sun cast long shadows across the range as Elena methodically unpacked her equipment, each movement deliberate and practiced, while the other competitors assembled their state-of-the-art Chaitak M200 intervention rifles and Barrett M82A1, systems worth more than most people's cars. Elena laid out her grandfather's rifle on a worn canvas mat that had seen more battlefields than most soldiers ever would. The contrast was striking and intentional. "Hey, Vasquez," called out Master Sergeant Rick Morrison, adjusting the scope on his $15,000 precision rifle system. "You sure you're in the right place? The World War II reenactment is happening over at the museum." His comment drew chuckles from the assembled snipers, all elite marksmen who had been selected for this inter-service precision shooting competition from bases across the country. Elena didn't respond immediately. She had learned over her 12 years in the Army that words rarely changed minds, but results always did. Instead, she continued her methodical preparation, running her fingers along the Springfield's worn wooden stock with the familiarity of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. The rifle bore the scars of age and use, small nicks in the wood, areas where the bluing had worn thin from countless hands, and a brass plate screwed into the stock that read SSGT, Miguel Vasquez, 1st Rangers, Normandy 1944. The other snipers represented the pinnacle of modern military technology. Sergeant First Class Ashley Chun sported a custom-built rifle system with a computerized ballistic calculator that could factor in wind speed, humidity, temperature, and even the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams had brought a semi-automatic system capable of engaging multiple targets in rapid succession with precision that previous generations of marksmen could only dream of. These were weapons that cost more than Elena's annual salary, equipped with thermal imaging, range-finding capabilities, and computer-assisted targeting systems. Elena's rifle, by comparison, looked like it belonged in a museum display case rather than a modern shooting competition. The wood stock showed decades of careful maintenance, but couldn't hide its age. The iron sights, though perfectly zeroed, seemed primitive compared to the advanced optics surrounding her. The bolt-action mechanism required manual cycling between shots, making rapid engagement impossible. To the casual observer, bringing such a weapon to compete against modern precision systems seemed like bringing a horse to a car race. But Elena wasn't a casual observer, and neither was her rifle. She had grown up with stories of her grandfather, Miguel Vasquez, though he had rarely spoken about his war experiences directly. What she knew came in fragments, overheard conversations between adults, faded photographs in old albums, and occasional glimpses of medals kept in a wooden box in his bedroom closet. Miguel had been a sniper with the 1st Ranger Battalion, participating in the D-Day landings and the subsequent push across Europe. The rifle had been his constant companion through campaigns in France, Belgium, and Germany, accounting for what military records tersely described as numerous confirmed enemy eliminations. After the war, Miguel had returned to New Mexico, working as a hunting guide and occasionally participating in civilian shooting competitions. He had won consistently, but always quietly, preferring to let his performance speak rather than drawing attention to his military service. When Elena had shown interest in shooting as a teenager, he had begun teaching her. passing on not just marksmanship skills, but an entire philosophy of precision shooting that seemed to transcend the mechanical aspects of the weapon itself. Rifle had come to her after Miguel's death 5 years earlier, along with a leather-bound logbook that documented every shot he had fired in competition and combat. The entries were meticulous: range, weather conditions, ammunition specifications, and results. What struck Elena most about the logbook was not the impressive accuracy statistics, but the marginal notes that revealed her grandfather's deep understanding of factors that modern, ballistic computers tried to quantify but could never fully capture. Wind at 300 yards different from surface wind, read one entry. Mirage patterns show thermal layers at 600. Another note simply stated, "Trust the rifle, it knows." These weren't the observations of someone relying on technology to make calculations. They were insights from a marksman who had developed an almost supernatural ability to read environmental conditions and adjust accordingly. Elena had spent the first year after inheriting the rifle simply learning its characteristics. Unlike modern precision weapons designed for consistency and ease of use, the Springfield required intimate knowledge of its particular quirks and preferences. She learned that it shot slightly left in humidity above 70%, that the trigger pull varied minutely with temperature changes, and that certain types of ammunition performed better than others in specific weather conditions. These weren't flaws to be corrected. They were personality traits to be understood and accommodated. The other competitors had finished their equipment setup and were engaging in the traditional pre-competition banter that served to mask pre-performance nerves. Elena continued her preparation in silence, checking and rechecking elements of her rifle that had been checked hundreds of times before. This wasn't nervousness. It was ritual, a meditative process that connected her to the weapon and, by extension, to the grandfather who had taught her that precision shooting was as much about mental discipline as mechanical accuracy. "Seriously, though," said Staff Sergeant Jennifer Park, pausing in her own preparation to watch Elena's methodical routine. "That thing's got to be at least 80 years old. How do you even get ammunition for it?" The question wasn't entirely hostile, but it carried the assumption that Elena's choice of weapon was either nostalgic foolishness or deliberate handicapping for dramatic effect. Elena looked up from her rifle for the first time since arriving at the range. "Springfield Armory still manufactures the ammunition," she said simply. "Same specifications as 1944. Some things don't need to be improved." The comment drew more laughter from the group, but Elena noticed that a few of the more experienced snipers weren't laughing. These were men and women who had spent years perfecting their craft, who understood that accuracy ultimately came from the shooter, not the equipment. They recognized something in Elena's demeanor that suggested she wasn't here as a novelty act or publicity stunt. Master Sergeant Tom Bradley, a veteran of 3 combat deployments and holder of several long-range shooting records, approached Elena's position with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "That's a beautiful rifle," he said, examining the Springfield with the appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship. "Mind if I ask how you came by it?" "My grandfather's," Elena replied, not looking up from her preparation. "He carried it through World War II." Bradley nodded with the respect that one combat veteran shows for another, even across generations. "Ranger tab on your uniform says you've seen some action yourself. How does the old girl perform downrange?" Elena finally looked up, meeting Bradley's eyes with a steady gaze that hinted at depths of experience rarely seen in someone her age. "She performs exactly as designed, Sergeant. Every time." The range safety officer called for competitors to take their positions for the initial qualification round, ending the informal conversation period. As Elena moved to her assigned firing position, she caught fragments of continued commentary from the other shooters. Most of it was good-natured ribbing about her choice of weapon, but underneath the humor was a current of genuine curiosity about whether she could actually compete with Such antiquated equipment, Elena settled into her shooting position with movements that seemed almost choreographed. The rifle came to her shoulder with practiced ease, the worn stock fitting perfectly against her cheek, the iron sights aligning with natural precision. She had fired thousands of rounds from this exact position, in conditions ranging from perfect weather to torrential rain, at distances from 50 yards to over a mile. The Springfield felt like an extension of her body rather than a separate tool. Around her, the other competitors were making final adjustments to their advanced optics, consulting digital wind meters and inputting data into ballistic calculators. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the subtle air currents across her face, listening to the whisper of wind through the grass, sensing atmospheric conditions through methods that no computer could replicate. When she opened her eyes, she had already made all the adjustments she needed, compensations calculated not through mathematics, but through an intuitive understanding of ballistics that her grandfather had spent a lifetime developing and passing. On the range fell silent as the safety officer prepared to commence the competition. Elena's breathing slowed to the steady rhythm she had learned years ago, her heartbeat visible in the slight movement of the rifle's front sight. In a few moments, she would begin to demonstrate that some advantages couldn't be purchased with money or replicated with technology. She would prove that the partnership between a skilled marksman and a perfectly understood weapon could transcend the limitations that others saw as insurmountable. But for now, she simply waited, comfortable in the knowledge that she and her grandfather's rifle were about to remind everyone present why precision shooting was still called an art rather than a science. Elena had spent countless hours over the past 5 years trying to piece together the full story of her grandfather's service, but Miguel Vasquez had taken most of his secrets to the grave. What remained were fragments, a handful of faded photographs, military documents that revealed dates and locations, but little about actual operations, and the rifle itself, which seemed to hold mysteries that Elena was only beginning to understand. Leather logbook that had accompanied the Springfield contained more questions than answers. Miguel's entries were precise but cryptic, recording shots fired and conditions encountered, without explaining the circumstances that had required such precision. Target eliminated at 847 yards. Crosswind 12 miles per hour from southwest. Temperature 34 degrees, one shot. Read a typical entry from somewhere in France during the winter of 1944. Clinical language revealed nothing about whether the target had been an enemy sniper, an officer, or something else entirely. Elena had tried to research her grandfather's unit, the 1st Ranger Battalion, but found that many of their operations remained classified even decades after the war's end. What she could piece together suggested that Miguel had been part of specialized teams tasked with missions that went beyond conventional infantry operations. The Rangers had been involved in reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines, sabotage operations against critical infrastructure, and what military historians euphemistically called target elimination missions against high-value enemy personnel. Rifle itself bore evidence of modifications that Elena couldn't fully explain. The trigger had been adjusted to a pull weight that was lighter than standard military specifications, requiring a level of precision that suggested work by a master gunsmith. The stock had been subtly reshaped, apparently customized to fit Miguel's specific body dimensions and shooting style. Most intriguingly, the barrel showed signs of having been carefully modified, with bore measurements that differed slightly from standard Springfield specifications in ways that Elena's gunsmith had described as professionally done but highly unusual. These modifications weren't the kind of field expedients that soldiers typically made to improve their equipment. They represented hours of careful work by someone with intimate knowledge of ballistics and precision manufacturing. Elena had wondered whether Miguel had made these changes himself, or whether they had been performed by military armorers for specific operational requirements. Either explanation suggested that her grandfather's role in the war had been far more specialized than his modest demeanor had ever indicated. The ammunition situation had been particularly puzzling. While Elena had told the other snipers that Springfield Armory still manufactured appropriate cartridges, the truth was more complicated. She had discovered that Miguel had left behind several thousand rounds of what appeared to be custom-loaded ammunition, each cartridge hand-assembled with components that were no longer standard. The powder charges were precisely measured too, weights that didn't match any factory specifications Elena could find. The bullets themselves were of a design that had apparently been discontinued shortly after the war, when Elena had taken a few of these cartridges to a ballistics expert for analysis. The results had been surprising. The custom loads produced velocities and accuracy that exceeded anything available commercially, but the powder composition included elements that the expert couldn't immediately identify. Whoever loaded these knew what they were doing, the specialist had told her. This is competition-grade precision work, but with some techniques I've never seen before. Elena had tried using modern ammunition in the rifle, but the results had been disappointing compared to her grandfather's custom loads. The weapon seemed designed around the specific ballistic characteristics of Miguel's hand-loaded cartridges, as if the rifle and ammunition had been developed as an integrated system, rather than separate components. This realization had led Elena to begin learning the art of hand-loading ammunition herself, using Miguel's detailed notes to recreate his formulations as closely as possible. The process had been painstaking and occasionally dangerous. Miguel's notes were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with abbreviations and references that Elena had to decode through trial and error. Some entries referred to powder types by codes that she eventually realized were military designations from the 1940s. Others mentioned environmental factors that affected powder performance in ways that weren't covered in modern reloading manuals. Gradually, Elena had begun to understand that her grandfather's approach to ammunition had been based on principles that went far beyond simple accuracy. He had been creating cartridges designed for specific environmental conditions, with variations optimized for different temperatures, humidity levels, and altitudes. The logbook contained dozens of different load formulations, each tagged with notes about when and where they should be used. This level of sophistication suggested that Miguel's wartime shooting had involved far more than the straightforward marksmanship that Elena had imagined. The precision required to develop such specialized ammunition implied missions where a single shot had to be absolutely certain under challenging conditions. Elena began to suspect that her grandfather had been involved in operations where missing the target would have meant not just mission failure, but potentially the loss of American lives. Her own military service had provided context for understanding some of what Miguel must have experienced. Elena had completed 2 combat deployments as a designated marksman, engaging targets at ranges up to 600 yards in support of infantry operations. She had learned firsthand the psychological pressure of knowing that other soldiers depended on her accuracy, and the weight of responsibility that came with taking human lives in combat. But Elena's combat experience, intense as it had been, paled in comparison to what Miguel's logbook suggested about his service. The ranges recorded in his entries consistently exceeded anything Elena had encountered in modern warfare. Shots at distances over 800 yards were routine, with several entries documenting successful engagements at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Given the technology available in 1944, such distances represented the absolute limits of what was possible with any rifle, requiring not just exceptional marksmanship, but an understanding of ballistics that bordered on the supernatural. Elena had tried to verify some of Miguel's claimed achievements through military records, but found that most documentation from his unit remained classified or had been lost over the decades. The few records she could access contained tantalizing hints, commendations for exceptional marksmanship under combat conditions, references to specialized reconnaissance missions, and recommendations for decorations that had apparently never been awarded, possibly for security reasons. The most intriguing document Elena had found was a letter from Miguel's commanding officer, written shortly after the end of the war. The letter recommended Miguel for what it described as the highest recognition for extraordinary service in operations that must remain classified, but noted that the nature of Sergeant Vasquez's contributions to the war effort cannot be publicly acknowledged without compromising ongoing security interests. The letter concluded with a promise that, when appropriate declassification occurs, Sergeant Vasquez's service will be recognized as among the most significant individual contributions to Allied victory in the European theater. That declassification had never occurred, at least not publicly. Elena had submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for records related to her grandfather's service, but had received responses indicating that relevant documents remained classified under provisions related to national security and ongoing intelligence operations. The implication was that Miguel's wartime activities had involved information or techniques that the government still considered sensitive more than 70 years after the fact. Elena had also tried to contact other veterans from Miguel's unit, but found that most had passed away, and those few who remained alive were reluctant to discuss their wartime service in any detail. One elderly veteran, reached by phone, had become noticeably uncomfortable when Elena mentioned her grandfather's name. Miguel was the best, the man had said after a long pause. But some things we promised never to talk about. You understand. He had hung up before Elena could ask any follow-up questions. These encounters had left Elena with the growing realization that her grandfather had been involved in activities that went far beyond conventional military operations. The rifle she had inherited wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a tool that had been used in missions that remained classified decades after their completion. The weapons modifications, the specialized ammunition, and Miguel's secretive attitude about his service all pointed to involvement in operations that had required capabilities beyond those of ordinary infantry marksmen. As Elena continued her pre-competition preparations, she reflected on how little she truly understood about the 5.E weapon she carried. She knew its mechanical characteristics intimately, had learned to replicate her grandfather's ammunition formulations, and had achieved remarkable accuracy in her own shooting. But the full story of what the rifle had been designed to do, and what Miguel had accomplished with it, remained locked away in classified files and the memories of men who had chosen to take their secrets to the grave. What Elena did know was that every time she fired the Springfield, she felt connected to something larger than herself. The rifle seemed to carry with it an accumulated wisdom from countless hours of use by a master marksman, as if Miguel's understanding of precision shooting had somehow become embedded in the weapon itself. Elena had learned to trust these instincts, even when they contradicted what modern ballistics calculators suggested was optimal. Word of Elena's rifle spread through the competition like wildfire, but not in the casual gossip manner that typically characterized military gatherings. Instead, it moved through hushed conversations between senior personnel, urgent phone calls to colleagues not present, and the kind of reverent whispers usually reserved for encounters with living legends. Elena found herself at the center of a tension that felt both overwhelming and deeply uncomfortable. Within minutes of Colonel Morrison's revelation about Operation Longbow, 3 additional senior officers had materialized at the range, apparently summoned by text messages and phone calls from those who had witnessed the initial discovery. Elena watched with growing bewilderment as these men, all bearing insignia indicating extensive special operations experience, approached her position with expressions that mixed professional curiosity with something approaching awe. Chief Master Sergeant David Torres, whose uniform displayed ribbons indicating service in every major conflict of the past 2 decades, was the first to arrive. His approach was different from the casual interest shown by earlier observers. He moved with the deliberate respect of someone approaching a shrine rather than a shooting competition. When he spoke, his voice carried the hushed tone typically used in places of historical significance. "Ma'am, if I may," Torres said, not reaching for the rifle but clearly wanting to examine it more closely. "I've spent 28 years in special operations, and I've heard stories about longbow rifles that I always assumed were myths. The idea that one still exists, in operational condition, carried by a family member of one of the original operators." He trailed off, shaking his head in apparent disbelief. Elena handed him the Springfield, watching as he examined it with the careful attention of someone who understood they were handling an artifact of immense historical significance. Torres's inspection was thorough but reverent, his experienced hands tracing modifications that Elena was only beginning to understand represented cutting-edge military technology from 8 decades earlier. "The barrel work alone," Torres murmured, more to himself than to Elena. "Look at this rifling pattern. I've never seen anything like it outside of theoretical ballistics papers from the 1980s. How did they achieve this level of precision with 1940s manufacturing technology?" Colonel Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private despite the growing crowd of interested observers. "Chief Torres has been researching unconventional warfare techniques for his doctoral dissertation," he explained to Elena. "He knows more about classified World War II programs than most historians." Torres looked up from his examination of the rifle with an expression of profound respect. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, do you have any idea what your grandfather accomplished with this weapon? I mean, do you know any specifics about his operational record?" Elena shook her head, feeling increasingly out of her depth as she realized that her family inheritance was apparently far more significant than she had ever imagined. "He never talked about the war. I have his logbook with some shooting records, but no details about actual missions or targets." "His logbook," Torres repeated, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "You have Miguel Vasquez's operational records? Do you realize what that represents?" He looked around at the assembled officers as if seeking confirmation that he wasn't hallucinating the conversation. A new voice joined the discussion as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Williams approached the group. Elena recognized her as one of the competition judges, but Williams's demeanor had shifted from official oversight to something approaching pilgrimage. "Excuse me, but did someone just say Miguel Vasquez? As in Sergeant Miguel Vasquez from the 1st Rangers?" Torres nodded emphatically. "This is his granddaughter carrying his longbow rifle. She has his operational records." Williams went completely still for a moment, then looked at Elena with an expression that mixed shock, respect, and something that might have been fear. "Ma'am, your grandfather. He's mentioned in classified documents that I've had access to through my security clearance. He's referred to by a code name that translates to Ghost Walker, the missions attributed to that designation." She paused, clearly struggling with how much classified information she could reveal in a public setting. Elena felt a chill of recognition at the term. She had seen references to El Caminati Fantasma in her grandfather's logbook, written in his careful script alongside certain entries, but had assumed it was some kind of personal nickname or inside joke with his fellow soldiers. Now she realized it had been an operational designation, possibly one that struck fear into enemy forces across occupied Europe. "What kind of missions?" Elena asked, though part of her wondered if she really wanted to know the answer. Williams glanced around at the other officers, clearly seeking guidance about how much she could reveal. Colonel Morrison nodded slightly, apparently giving permission for a limited briefing. "The kind that required eliminating high-value targets without alerting enemy forces to Allied presence," Williams said carefully. "Strategic assassinations that prevented enemy operations, protected resistance networks, and supported major Allied offensives." Chief Torres resumed his examination of the rifle, but his attention had shifted to specific components that Elena hadn't fully understood. "The scope mounting system," he said, pointing to modifications that Elena had assumed were simply upgrades. "For improved accuracy. This predates modern quick-detach systems by decades, but it's actually more sophisticated than most contemporary designs. And look at this trigger mechanism. The precision adjustment capabilities are extraordinary." Elena watched as more personnel continued to arrive at her position, each new arrival bringing additional layers of recognition and respect for what she was carrying. A major from Army Intelligence Services approached with a tablet computer, apparently accessing databases that contained information Elena couldn't imagine. "Ma'am," the major said after several minutes of consultation with his device, "I'm seeing references to operational reports that mention a sniper-designated Ghost Walker achieving confirmed eliminations at ranges exceeding 1,200 yards. In 1,944, with the technology available then, such distances were considered impossible." Elena found herself surrounded by an impromptu briefing session as various officers shared fragments of information about her grandfather's service, each piece adding to a picture of extraordinary capability and historical significance that she was struggling to process. The casual shooting competition had transformed into something approaching a military historical conference, with her grandfather's rifle serving as the centerpiece. Master Sergeant Bradley, who had initiated the entire sequence of revelations, approached with a senior warrant officer Elena hadn't seen earlier. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, this is Chief Warrant Officer Martinez from Special Operations Command. He specializes in historical weapons analysis for classified programs." Martinez extended his hand with the formal courtesy reserved for meeting someone of significant importance. "Ma'am, it's an honor to meet a family member of Miguel Vasquez. Your grandfather's contributions to special operations techniques are still studied at the highest levels of classification. The fact that his operational equipment survives and is apparently still functional represents an unprecedented opportunity for historical analysis." Elena shook Martinez's hand, still struggling to reconcile the quiet man who had taught her to shoot tin cans in the New Mexico desert with the legendary figure these officers were describing. "I'm beginning to realize I didn't know my grandfather at all," she said quietly. "That was probably intentional," Martinez replied. "Operators at his level typically compartmentalize their wartime service completely. The psychological burden of that type of mission profile, combined with security requirements that lasted decades beyond the war's end, meant that most longbow personnel never discussed their service with anyone, including family members." Torres had completed his examination of the rifle and was now studying Elena with the same intense attention he had given the weapon. "Staff Sergeant, have you fired this rifle competitively? I mean, have you tested its capabilities under precision shooting conditions?" "I've been shooting it regularly for 5 years," Elena replied. "I've achieved consistent accuracy that seemed remarkable, but I always attributed that to my grandfather's meticulous maintenance and my own training." "What kind of accuracy?" Williams asked, her tone suggesting that Elena's answer might be significant. Elena hesitated, suddenly self-conscious about claiming capabilities that might sound impossible to experienced marksmen. "I've been able to achieve consistent hits at ranges up to 1,000 yards, using my grandfather's hand-loaded ammunition and environmental reading techniques." The silence that followed Elena's statement was profound and telling. The assembled officers exchanged glances that spoke of shared understanding about the extraordinary nature of what she had just described. Achieving such accuracy with 1940s technology, even with the longbow modifications, required not just exceptional equipment, but skills that approached the supernatural. Chief Torres was the first to break the silence. "Ma'am, what you're describing isn't just remarkable accuracy. It's a level of precision that validates everything we've read about your grandfather's operational capabilities. You're not just carrying his rifle, you're continuing his legacy. Colonel Morrison stepped away from the growing crowd for a moment to make a series of phone calls. His voice too low for Elena to hear, but his body language suggesting conversations of significant importance. When he returned, his expression had shifted to something approaching formal ceremony, as if he were preparing to conduct an official briefing rather than continue casual discussion. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "I've just received clearance to share information with you that has been classified for over 70 years. What I'm about to tell you about your grandfather's service has never been publicly acknowledged, and some of it may be difficult to hear." Elena nodded, though she felt a growing sense of apprehension about what revelations were coming. The officers around her had formed a loose circle, creating a barrier of privacy that suggested the conversation was about to enter territory that required careful handling. Morrison opened a folder that had appeared during his phone conversations, apparently containing documents that had been transmitted electronically from whatever sources he had contacted. "Miguel Vasquez wasn't just a sniper with the 1st Rangers," he began. "He was the primary operator for a program that developed precision elimination techniques for targets that conventional forces couldn't reach. Between June 1944 and May 1945, he was personally responsible for operations that altered the course of major Allied campaigns." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet as Morrison's words began to paint a picture of her grandfather's service that bore no resemblance to anything she had imagined. The quiet man who had taught her to appreciate the mechanics of accurate shooting had apparently been one of the most effective killers in the history of American special operations. "The Normandy invasion," Morrison continued, consulting his documents, "required eliminating German observation posts that could have called in artillery strikes on Allied landing forces. Conventional approaches would have required major assaults that would have alerted enemy commanders to the invasion areas. Your grandfather solved the problem by eliminating 17 key observers at ranges between 800 and 1,400 yards, using techniques that allowed him to remain completely undetected." Chief Torres stepped forward, adding context that made Elena's head spin with the implications. "Staff Sergeant, what Colonel Morrison is describing isn't just exceptional marksmanship. It's strategic impact that saved thousands of Allied lives. Those observation posts could have directed fire onto beaches where American soldiers were landing with no cover. Your grandfather's work was directly responsible for the success of operations that broke open the Western Front." Elena tried to process the scale of what she was hearing, but found herself struggling with the disconnect between the gentle man who had patiently taught her shooting fundamentals and the legendary figure being described by these officers. "How is it possible that no one has ever heard of this?" she asked. Lieutenant Colonel Williams consulted her own notes before answering. "Because the techniques your grandfather developed were so effective that they became the foundation for programs that are still classified today. The methods he pioneered for ultra-long-range precision shooting, environmental condition analysis, and target identification are still being used by special operations forces around the world." Martinez, the warrant officer specializing in historical weapons analysis, had been taking detailed photographs of Elena's rifle while the briefing continued. "Ma'am, the modifications on this weapon represent innovations that were decades ahead of their time. The barrel harmonics optimization, the trigger system refinements, the scope mounting solutions. These improvements predicted developments that didn't appear in civilian or even military technology until the 1970s. Elena looked down at the Springfield with new eyes, beginning to understand that every detail she had attributed to her grandfather's mechanical skill had actually been the result of cutting-edge military research. But why keep it secret for so long? The war ended 79 years ago. Morrison's expression grew more serious as he prepared to address the most sensitive aspects of Miguel's service. Because your grandfather's operations extended far beyond the conventional end of the war. After Germany's surrender, he was assigned to missions in occupied territories that involved eliminating war criminals who had escaped capture, disrupting underground Nazi networks, and preventing the establishment of resistance cells that could have destabilized post-war reconstruction efforts. Torres added details that made Elena's blood run cold. The Ghost Walker designation continued to be used for operations in Eastern Europe, South America, and other locations where former Nazi officials were attempting to establish new power bases. Your grandfather's ability to eliminate targets without detection made him invaluable for missions that required absolute deniability. Elena felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning, but one question kept surfacing above all others. How do you know all this? I thought you said the records were classified. Williams answered with a slight smile that suggested Elena had touched on something important. Because your presence here today, carrying that rifle, has triggered security protocols that automatically notify personnel with appropriate clearances. The fact that a longbow weapon has appeared in an official military setting means that certain information can now be shared with family members under provisions that were established specifically for this possibility. Elena realized that her decision to compete in a precision shooting competition had accidentally activated intelligence procedures that had been waiting in place for decades, designed to handle exactly the situation that was now unfolding. Her grandfather's legacy had been protected by systems that assumed someone in his family might eventually seek to understand his service. Martinez had completed his photographic documentation and was now examining Elena's shooting equipment with intense interest. Staff Sergeant, the ammunition you're using, did you manufacture it yourself using your grandfather's specifications? Yes, Elena replied. I have his loading data and component specifications. It took me almost 2 years to source the correct powder and bullets. Martinez exchanged meaningful glances with the other officers before responding. Ma'am, what you've accomplished represents the preservation of technology that military research facilities have been trying to recreate for decades. Your grandfather's ammunition formulations were lost when the longbow program was terminated, and subsequent attempts to duplicate his performance have failed. Elena stared at her carefully prepared cartridges, realizing that what she had considered a hobby restoration project had actually been the preservation of military technology that professional researchers couldn't replicate. Are you saying that the loads I've been using are unique? More than unique, Torres replied. They represent the only surviving examples of ammunition specifically designed for ultra-long-range precision work using 1940s components. Military ballistics experts have been trying to reverse engineer these formulations from fragmentary records, but without success. Morrison opened another section of his folder, revealing documents that appeared to contain mission summaries and operational assessments. Staff Sergeant, your grandfather's confirmed elimination record extends to 247 targets over 11 months of active operations. But more importantly, intelligence analysis suggests that his work prevented enemy operations that could have cost thousands of Allied lives. Elena felt the emotional weight of these revelations settling over her like a heavy blanket, as she began to understand that her family inheritance carried not just historical significance but moral complexity that she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. Miguel hadn't just been a skilled marksman. He had been an instrument of strategic warfare, whose actions had shaped the outcome of the most significant conflict in human history. The techniques he developed, Williams continued, formed the foundation for every precision shooting program that followed. Modern sniper training incorporates principles that your grandfather pioneered, though most instructors have no idea where those techniques originated. Elena looked around at the circle of officers, all of whom were studying her with expressions that mixed respect, curiosity, and something approaching anticipation. "What does this mean for me? Why are you telling me all this now?" Morrison closed his folder and looked directly at Elena with an intensity that suggested his next words carried particular significance. "Because, Staff Sergeant Vasquez, your presence here today demonstrates that Miguel's knowledge and capabilities didn't die with him. You've not only preserved his equipment and techniques, you've proven that you can use them effectively. That makes you potentially invaluable to operations that require the same capabilities your grandfather provided." Elena felt a chill of understanding as she realized that this revelation wasn't just about honoring her grandfather's memory. The officers surrounding her weren't simply sharing historical information. They were evaluating her as a potential asset for missions that required skills that only one family line had proven capable of mastering. The competitive atmosphere of the morning was shattered by the urgent buzzing of multiple cell phones simultaneously, receiving priority alerts. Elena watched as every officer around her immediately checked their devices, their expressions shifting from historical fascination to immediate operational concern. Colonel Morrison was the first to answer his phone, stepping away from the group while speaking in the clipped, urgent tones that Elena recognized from her own combat deployments. "Sir, understood. What's the timeline?" Morrison's voice carried across the range despite his obvious attempts to keep the conversation private. "Negative, sir. Weather conditions make helicopter insertion impossible, and ground approach would take too long." A pause during which Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim. "Copy that. We'll implement whatever options are available." Elena felt the familiar knot of anticipation in her stomach that preceded deployment announcements, even though she was ostensibly here as a competition participant rather than an operational asset. The other officers were engaged in similar conversations, using terminology that suggested a developing situation requiring immediate military response. Chief Torres ended his call first and approached Elena with an expression that mixed urgency with something approaching desperation. "Staff Sergeant, we have a situation developing that may require capabilities that only exist in one place on this continent." He gestured toward her grandfather's rifle with meaning that Elena was beginning to understand. "What kind of situation?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would involve exactly the type of precision shooting that Miguel's equipment had been designed to accomplish. Morrison concluded his call and rejoined the group, his demeanor having shifted completely from historical discussion to operational planning. 47 minutes ago, a group of domestic terrorists seized the observation deck of the Stratosphere Tower in Las Vegas. They're holding 16 civilians hostage, including 3 children, and have threatened to begin executing hostages if their demands aren't met within the next 4 hours. Elena felt her pulse quicken as Morrison continued the briefing, recognizing the professional terminology that indicated a situation requiring immediate special operations response. The tower stands 1,149 feet above ground level, with the observation deck at 869 feet. The terrorists have positioned themselves to prevent any conventional approach. They have clear sight lines in all directions, and they're monitoring police frequencies. Lieutenant Colonel Williams consulted information on her tablet computer, adding details that made Elena's blood run cold. Local SWAT teams have snipers positioned on nearby buildings, but the maximum effective range from available positions is approximately 600 yards. The terrorists chose their location specifically to exceed the capabilities of conventional law enforcement marksmen. Torres stepped closer to Elena, his voice dropping to the urgent tone used for operational briefings. "Staff Sergeant, the closest position that offers a clear shot at the terrorist positions is 1,247 yards from the target area. The environmental conditions include crosswinds at multiple altitudes, thermal distortion from the desert heat, and Atmospheric pressure variations that make precision shooting at that range extremely challenging. Elena felt the pieces of the situation clicking together with horrible clarity as she realized why these officers were briefing her rather than simply responding with available military assets. "You're telling me that no one currently deployed can make that shot?" Morrison nodded grimly. "FBI hostage rescue team has excellent marksmen, but their equipment and training protocols aren't designed for ultra-long range precision work under these specific conditions. The shot requires capabilities that were pioneered by your grandfather and haven't been successfully replicated by any current military or law enforcement unit." Elena looked down at the Springfield in her hands, beginning to understand that her presence at this shooting competition had coincided with exactly the type of impossible situation that Miguel's techniques had been developed to address. What about military special operations? Surely someone has the training and equipment for this kind of shot. The closest qualified military sniper teams are currently deployed overseas, Williams replied, consulting her tablet for updated information. Even if we could recall them immediately, the time required for deployment would exceed the terrorists' deadline. We have 3 hours and 13 minutes before they begin executing hostages. Martinez, who had been quietly observing the discussion, stepped forward with information that added another layer of complexity to the situation. "Ma'am, I've been analyzing the environmental conditions in Las Vegas right now, comparing them to entries in your grandfather's logbook. The wind patterns, temperature gradients, and atmospheric pressure readings are nearly identical to conditions he encountered during a mission in the Italian Alps in 1945. Elena felt a chill of recognition as she remembered reading that particular logbook entry, one of the few that had included detailed environmental notations. Miguel had recorded a successful elimination at 1,320 yards under conditions that he had described as challenging but manageable with proper technique and equipment adjustment. Torres had been making calculations on a tablet computer, cross-referencing ballistic data with environmental conditions and distance measurements. "Staff Sergeant, based on your grandfather's ammunition specifications and the rifle's confirmed capabilities, a shot from the proposed position is technically possible. The question is whether you have sufficient familiarity with his techniques to execute under operational pressure." Elena realized that the theoretical discussion about her grandfather's legacy had suddenly become a life-or-death decision that would determine the fate of 16 innocent people. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden, accompanied by the terrifying realization that she might be the only person in the country capable of preventing a massacre. Morrison's phone buzzed with another priority message, and his expression grew even more serious as he read the update. "The situation has escalated. The terrorists have released a video showing the hostages, and they've moved their deadline up by 1 hour. We now have 2 hours and 8 minutes to resolve this situation, or they begin killing civilians." Elena looked around at the circle of officers, all of whom were studying her with expressions that mixed professional assessment with desperate hope. She understood that they weren't simply asking her to demonstrate her marksmanship skills. They were requesting that she accept responsibility for a mission that would require not just exceptional shooting, but the kind of split-second decision-making that had made her grandfather legendary. "What kind of shot placement are we talking about?" Elena asked, her voice steadier than she felt as she began to process the tactical requirements of the situation. "How many targets? What kind of positioning? What are the rules of engagement?" Williams displayed tactical diagrams on her tablet, showing the layout of the observation deck and the positions of both terrorists and hostages. 3 primary targets, positioned to maintain visual contact with each other and overlapping fields of fire on the hostages. Any conventional assault would result in civilian casualties, because the terrorists would have several seconds to react before multiple entry teams could neutralize all threats simultaneously. Torres pointed to specific positions on the diagram, explaining the tactical challenge with the precision of someone who had planned similar operations. The only way to prevent hostage casualties is to eliminate all 3 targets within a time window of less than 2 seconds. That requires precision placement at extreme range, with environmental compensation that exceeds anything in current military doctrine. Elena studied the tactical situation, recognizing elements that aligned almost perfectly with scenarios described in her grandfather's logbook. Miguel had faced similar challenges during operations where civilian casualties had to be prevented while eliminating multiple targets positioned for mutual support. Morrison received another phone call, this one brief and obviously containing authorization from high-level command authority. When he concluded the conversation, he approached Elena with the formal bearing of someone delivering official orders. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I've just received clearance to offer you temporary assignment to a joint task force operation under provisions that authorize the use of specialized capabilities for domestic emergency response." Elena understood that she was being offered not just the opportunity to help, but formal military authority to attempt something that no one else was qualified to accomplish. The competition that had begun as a tribute to her grandfather's memory had become the prelude to continuing his legacy in the most dramatic way possible. "If I accept this assignment," Elena said carefully, "I need guarantees about operational support, backup planning, and extraction procedures. I won't attempt this mission without proper tactical coordination and emergency protocols." Morrison nodded with the respect due someone who understood operational requirements. "You'll have full tactical support, real-time intelligence updates, and extraction assets positioned for immediate response. This isn't a suicide mission, Staff Sergeant. It's a precision operation using capabilities that exist nowhere else in the current military structure." Elena looked one final time at her grandfather's Springfield, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether Miguel's techniques could save lives in the 21st century just as they had during World War II. Elena stared at the tactical diagrams on Williams's tablet, her mind racing through calculations that went far beyond simple ballistics. The shot itself was technically achievable. She had demonstrated similar precision during her own training with Miguel's equipment and ammunition. But this wasn't target shooting on a controlled range with unlimited time for preparation and adjustment. This was a life-or-death situation where 16 innocent people would die if she made even the smallest error in judgment or execution. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing in a way that her combat deployments never had. During her tours in Afghanistan, Elena had engaged targets as part of larger operations where her individual performance, while important, was part of a coordinated effort involving dozens of other soldiers. If she missed a shot, other team members could compensate. If her equipment failed, backup systems and personnel were available. But this situation was different in every conceivable way. "I need to understand something," Elena said, looking directly at Colonel Morrison. "Why me? I mean specifically, why are you asking someone with my limited operational experience to attempt something that trained special operations snipers apparently can't accomplish?" Morrison's response was immediate and brutally honest. "Because you're the only person in North America who has access to equipment and techniques that were specifically designed for exactly this type of scenario. Your grandfather's rifle isn't just historically significant. It's functionally superior to modern systems for ultra-long-range precision work under adverse conditions." Chief Torres stepped forward, adding context that made Elena's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Staff Sergeant, modern military sniper systems are optimized for reliability, durability, and ease of use by multiple operators. They're designed to achieve consistent accuracy across a wide range of conditions and users. But they sacrifice maximum potential performance for operational flexibility." Elena understood what Torres was explaining, but the implications terrified her. You're saying that my grandfather's rifle can do things that modern equipment can't, but only if the operator has his specific knowledge and techniques. Exactly, Martinez confirmed. The modifications on that weapon, combined with your grandfather's ammunition formulations and environmental reading methods, create a system that can achieve precision beyond anything in current military arsenals, but only for someone who understands the complete integrated approach. Elena looked down at the Springfield, seeing it with new clarity as both an incredible gift and an almost unbearable burden. Miguel had passed on to her not just a family heirloom, but a level of responsibility that she was only beginning to comprehend. Every hour she had spent learning to use his equipment, every round she had fired while developing her own skills, had been preparation for exactly this kind of moment. Lieutenant Colonel Williams approached with additional information. That added another layer of pressure to the decision Elena was facing. Staff Sergeant, I've just received an update from the scene. The terrorists have released another video showing that they've separated the hostages into 3 groups, positioning them in locations where any conventional assault would result in multiple civilian casualties. Elena studied the updated tactical layout, recognizing tactical positioning that seemed almost designed to require the specific capabilities that her grandfather's techniques provided. It's like they planned this scenario specifically to exceed normal law enforcement response capabilities. That's exactly what they did, Morrison confirmed grimly. Intelligence analysis suggests this group studied previous hostage situations to identify vulnerabilities in conventional tactical response. They chose the location, timing, and positioning specifically to create a situation that standard procedures couldn't resolve without significant civilian casualties. Torres had been working with his tablet computer, apparently accessing databases that contained additional information about similar historical situations. Ma'am, I've been reviewing records of comparable scenarios where your grandfather's techniques were employed. In every case, the precision and speed required exceeded what any contemporary operator could achieve using standard military equipment and training. Elena felt the circle of officers watching her with expressions that mixed hope, desperation, and professional assessment of her capabilities. She understood that they weren't simply asking her to take a difficult shot. They were requesting that she accept responsibility for proving that techniques developed 80 years ago could solve problems that modern technology couldn't address. What happens if I miss? Elena asked quietly, voicing the fear that was dominating her thoughts. What happens if the equipment fails? Or if I misjudge the environmental conditions? Or if something goes wrong that I can't predict or control? Morrison's answer was as honest as it was terrifying. Then 16 people die, and the failure of this operation probably means that similar techniques will never be attempted again under official auspices. You'd be carrying not just the immediate consequences, but the knowledge that these capabilities might be lost forever. Elena realized that accepting this mission meant accepting responsibility not just for the current hostage situation, but for preserving her grandfather's legacy for future crises that might require similar solutions. If she succeeded, Miguel's techniques would be validated and potentially incorporated into modern special operations doctrine. If she failed, both the hostages and her grandfather's reputation would become casualties of her inadequacy. Martinez had been quietly preparing equipment while the discussion continued, and now he approached with items that Elena recognized as specialized components for precision shooting. Ma'am, if you decide to accept this assignment, we have real-time atmospheric monitoring equipment, ballistic computers for environmental compensation, and communication systems that will provide constant tactical updates throughout the operation. Elena looked at the modern technology being offered, then back at her grandfather's simple but precisely crafted rifle. The contrast represented not just different eras of military equipment, but fundamentally different approaches to solving complex problems. Miguel's methods required intuitive understanding and personal skill rather than technological solutions, but they also demanded a level of individual responsibility that modern military systems were designed to distribute among multiple operators. "I need to know something about the tactical support," Elena said, her voice carrying the firmness of someone who understood operational requirements. "What kind of backup do I have if the primary approach fails? What happens if I determine that the shot isn't achievable under current conditions?" Williams consulted her tablet before responding with information that addressed Elena's professional concerns. "You'll have complete authority to abort the mission if you assess that success probability is unacceptable. We're not asking you to attempt a suicide mission or to take risks that exceed reasonable operational parameters." Torres added reassurance that demonstrated understanding of the psychological pressure Elena was facing. "Staff Sergeant, your grandfather's logbook contains entries documenting missions where he chose not to engage because conditions weren't optimal for success. Part of what made him exceptional was knowing when not to shoot, not just having the ability to make impossible shots." Elena thought about Miguel's careful notations in his logbook, remembering entries where he had recorded environmental conditions as unsuitable for engagement, despite having clear shots at high-value targets. Her grandfather had understood that precision shooting at extreme ranges required not just technical skill, but the wisdom to recognize when success was possible and when it wasn't. Morrison's phone buzzed with another update, and his expression grew more urgent as he read the message. "Staff Sergeant, we've received confirmation that the terrorists have accelerated their timeline again. We now have 97 minutes before they begin executing hostages. I need your decision." Elena looked around at the assembled officers, understanding that this moment would define not just the immediate crisis, but her own relationship with the legacy that Miguel had left her. She could decline the mission and live with the knowledge that she had chosen safety over service, or she could accept the assignment and discover whether she was truly worthy of carrying her grandfather's techniques forward. "Colonel Morrison," Elena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to, "I accept the assignment. But I do this using my grandfather's methods completely, his equipment, his ammunition, his techniques, and his judgment criteria. If you want these capabilities, you get them exactly as Miguel Vasquez developed them." Morrison nodded with the respect due someone who had just accepted extraordinary responsibility. "Understood, Staff Sergeant. We'll provide all necessary support, but the tactical decisions are yours to make." Elena picked up her grandfather's rifle, feeling its familiar weight settle into her hands like a promise that had been waiting 80 years to be fulfilled. The helicopter flight to Las Vegas took 43 minutes, during which Elena transformed from a shooting competition participant into an operational asset supporting a joint federal task force. The aircraft's cabin had been configured as a mobile command center, with communications equipment linking her to intelligence analysts, tactical coordinators, and on-scene commanders who were positioning support elements throughout the city. Elena spent the flight time studying real-time surveillance footage of the Stratosphere Tower, memorizing the positions of both terrorists and hostages while calculating the environmental factors that would affect her shot. The Springfield lay across her lap, no longer seeming like a historical artifact, but feeling instead like the precision instrument it had been designed to be. Every detail of the rifle's construction suddenly made perfect sense as Elena understood how each modification would contribute to the impossible shot she was about to attempt. Chief Torres sat beside her, monitoring atmospheric data from weather stations positioned around Las Vegas, while consulting Miguel's logbook for comparable environmental conditions. "Staff Sergeant, the wind patterns are almost identical to the Italian Alps mission your grandfather documented. Variable crosswinds at multiple altitudes, thermal distortion from heated surfaces, and atmospheric pressure fluctuations that will affect bullet trajectory at extreme range." Elena nodded, feeling Miguel's presence almost tangibly as she recognized conditions that he had faced and overcome decades earlier. What's the current wind speed at the target elevation? 12 miles per hour from the southwest at ground level. But satellite data shows different wind patterns at various altitudes between your position and the target. Torres replied, highlighting information that would have been impossible for Miguel to access in 1945. Your grandfather would have had to read these conditions through observation and intuition. Elena closed her eyes, remembering hours spent with Miguel learning to feel atmospheric conditions through subtle sensory cues that no instrument could measure. He had taught her to recognize thermal patterns by watching mirage effects, to judge wind direction changes by observing dust movement, and to sense atmospheric pressure variations through physical sensations that most people never noticed. Helicopter descended toward a building rooftop that had been selected as the optimal firing position, its location chosen through calculations that balanced distance, elevation, and sight lines to provide the clearest possible shot at the terrorist. Positions. Elena could see the Stratosphere Tower in the distance, its observation deck seeming impossibly small and distant, even though she knew the exact range measurements. Lieutenant Colonel Williams's voice crackled through Elena's headset as the aircraft settled onto the designated rooftop. Staff Sergeant, we have 54 minutes remaining before the deadline. Intelligence confirms 3 targets in fixed positions, with hostages arranged to prevent conventional assault options. You are authorized to engage when ready. Elena stepped out of the helicopter onto the rooftop, immediately feeling the environmental conditions that would determine the success or failure of her mission. The desert heat created thermal distortions that made distant objects shimmer and dance, exactly as Miguel had described in his logbook entries about similar conditions. The wind carried the distinctive character of air moving across urban surfaces, different from the natural desert winds she had trained with, but following patterns that Miguel's techniques could accommodate. Martinez had already positioned a spotting scope and communications equipment at the firing position, creating a miniature command post that provided Elena with real-time tactical information while maintaining the simplicity that Miguel's methods required. Ma'am, we have clear visual confirmation of all 3 targets and continuous monitoring of hostage positions. Weather conditions are stable and within acceptable parameters for the shot. Elena approached the firing position with movements that felt both familiar and momentous, understanding that she was about to attempt something that existed at the absolute limits of human capability. The Springfield felt perfectly balanced in her hands as she settled into the shooting position that Miguel had taught her, her body automatically adjusting to accommodate the rifle's specific characteristics. Through the scope, Elena could see the terrorists with startling clarity despite the extreme range. They moved with the confidence of people who believed themselves beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement, positioned to maintain visual contact with each other while covering all approaches to the hostage areas. Their tactical positioning was sophisticated, suggesting military training or extensive planning, but it was designed to counter modern assault techniques rather than the precision shooting capabilities that Elena carried. Range confirmed at 1,247 yards, Torres reported, his voice steady despite the tension that Elena could feel radiating from everyone around her. Environmental compensation calculations are available if needed. Elena ignored the offered technological assistance, instead focusing on sensory inputs that Miguel had taught her to trust above any mechanical computation. She could feel the thermal patterns rising from the sun-heated concrete below, sense the pressure variations that indicated atmospheric instability, and read wind conditions through subtle changes in the scope's image quality. The first shot had to be perfect. Elena had learned from Miguel's logbook that ultra-long-range precision shooting required not just accuracy, but the psychological impact of immediate, devastating effectiveness. The terrorists had to be eliminated so quickly and completely that they would have no opportunity to harm hostages or coordinate defensive responses. Elena's breathing slowed to the rhythm that Miguel had drilled into her during thousands of hours of training, her heartbeat visible in the slight movement of the crosshairs, but timed to allow for perfect shot placement between beats. The Springfield's trigger felt familiar under her finger, its precisely adjusted mechanism responding to pressure with the mechanical perfection that Miguel had achieved through decades of careful modification. The first terrorist centered in Elena's scope, his position offering the clearest shot and the greatest tactical threat to the hostages. At 1,247 yards, he appeared small and distant, but Elena's training had prepared her for shots at ranges that most marksmen considered impossible. Miguel's ammunition and his rifle's modifications were designed specifically for these conditions, creating a system that could achieve precision beyond anything in modern military arsenals. Elena squeezed the trigger with the smooth, consistent pressure that Miguel had taught her, feeling the Springfield recoil with its characteristic solid push that indicated perfect ammunition performance. The bullet's flight time at that range was nearly 2 seconds, an eternity during which Elena had to trust completely in calculations made through methods that couldn't be explained to others. The impact was immediate and devastating. Through her scope, Elena watched the first terrorist collapse with the sudden finality that indicated perfect shot placement. Before his body had finished falling, Elena was already cycling the bolt and acquiring the second target, her movements flowing with the mechanical precision that came from years of practice with Miguel's techniques. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The second shot followed within seconds of the first, Elena's muscle memory compensating for the slight differences in target position and environmental factors that affected trajectory at extreme range. The Springfield functioned exactly as Miguel had designed it to, each component working in perfect harmony to deliver precision that bordered on the supernatural. The third terrorist was already reacting to the loss of his companions when Elena's final shot eliminated him with the same devastating effectiveness. The entire engagement had lasted less than 15 seconds from first shot to final target elimination, achieving the tactical objective with a speed and precision that left the hostage rescue teams momentarily stunned. All targets neutralized, Williams's voice announced over the radio network, her tone mixing professional satisfaction with obvious amazement. Hostages are secure and unharmed. Outstanding work, Staff Sergeant. Elena remained in position for several moments, her scope still trained on the target area while tactical teams moved to secure the hostages and confirm the elimination of all threats. The Springfield felt warm in her hands, its metal surfaces heated by the desert sun and the energy of firing, but its performance had been flawless under conditions that would have challenged any weapon system ever built. As Elena finally lifted her head from the scope, she realized that she had done more than simply complete a successful mission. She had proven that Miguel's techniques could solve problems that modern technology couldn't address, validating 80 years of innovation and preserving capabilities that might otherwise have been lost forever. The successful mission represented not just the saving of 16 innocent lives, but the continuation of a legacy that connected Elena to her grandfather. Across decades of separation and silence, the aftermath of the successful mission unfolded with the controlled chaos typical of high-profile law enforcement operations. But Elena found herself at the center of a tension that felt both overwhelming and surreal. Within minutes of her final shot, helicopters carrying FBI hostage rescue team members were landing on the Stratosphere's observation deck, while ground teams secured the perimeter and began the complex process of evacuating 16 traumatized but unharmed civilians. Elena remained at her firing position, maintaining overwatch while tactical teams confirmed the elimination of all threats and established security around the hostage area. Through her scope, She could see paramedics attending to civilians who had spent hours believing they were about to die, their relief visible even at the extreme range from which she had operated. The knowledge that her grandfather's techniques had prevented a massacre created an emotional weight that she was still struggling to process. "Colonel," Morrison's voice crackled through her headset with updates that confirmed the complete success of the operation. "Staff Sergeant, all hostages have been evacuated safely with no injuries requiring hospitalization. FBI crime scene analysis confirms 3 precision eliminations with shot placement that prevented any defensive response or threat to civilians. From a tactical standpoint, this operation represents textbook execution of ultra-long-range precision shooting." Elena lifted her head from the scope for the first time since the engagement, blinking in the harsh desert sunlight as she tried to reconcile the magnitude of what she had accomplished with the familiar feel of her grandfather's rifle. In her hands, the Springfield had performed flawlessly, its 80-year-old mechanisms functioning with the reliability that Miguel had built into every component through decades of careful maintenance and modification. Chief Torres approached with expression that mixed professional respect with something approaching awe, carrying a tablet computer that displayed data from the mission that Elena was only beginning to understand. "Ma'am, the telemetry from our monitoring equipment shows shot groupings that exceed anything in current military documentation. At 1,247 yards, your 3-shot group measured 4.2 inches center to center, under environmental conditions that would challenge any contemporary sniper system." Elena stared at the numbers, recognizing performance that validated everything Miguel had claimed about his rifle's capabilities, while proving that she had successfully inherited not just his equipment, but his skills. "That's consistent with the accuracy I've achieved during training, but I never imagined it would translate to operational conditions under this kind of pressure." Martinez had been documenting the mission with equipment that recorded not just Elena's performance but the rifle's mechanical function throughout the engagement. "Staff Sergeant, what you've accomplished today represents validation of techniques that military researchers have been trying to recreate for decades. Your grandfather's integrated approach to ultra-long-range precision shooting has just been proven superior to anything in current special operations arsenals." The helicopter that would return Elena to Nellis Air Force Base arrived within 30 minutes of the mission's completion, but the flight back was dramatically different from the urgent deployment she had experienced earlier. Instead of tactical planning and nervous preparation, the cabin was filled with debriefing discussions and recognition that she had achieved something historically significant. Lieutenant Colonel Williams occupied the seat beside Elena, reviewing mission documentation that would become part of official military records documenting the successful employment of classified techniques under operational conditions. "Staff Sergeant, I want you to understand that what happened today goes far beyond a successful hostage rescue operation. You've demonstrated that your grandfather's methods can solve problems that modern military doctrine considers unsolvable." Elena looked out the helicopter's window at the Nevada desert passing below, thinking about Miguel and wondering whether he had ever imagined that his techniques would someday be used to save innocent lives in circumstances he couldn't have predicted. "I keep thinking about what my grandfather would say about all this. He was always so quiet about his service, so reluctant to discuss what he'd accomplished during the war." Torres, who had spent the flight analyzing performance data from Elena's rifle, looked up with information that provided context for Miguel's modesty about his achievements. "Ma'am, based on what we've learned about Operation Longbow and your grandfather's service record, he probably never spoke about his accomplishments because he understood that his capabilities placed him in a category that most people couldn't comprehend or accept." The helicopter landed at Nellis to a reception that Elena hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. The tarmac was filled with personnel from multiple branches of the military, representatives from federal law enforcement agencies, and media crews that had somehow learned about the successful resolution of the Las Vegas hostage crisis. Elena realized that her mission had attracted attention that extended far beyond the military community. As Elena stepped off the helicopter, still carrying her grandfather's Springfield, she was approached by a senior officer whose uniform displayed insignia indicating authority at the highest levels of military command. General Patricia Hawkins, whose reputation Elena knew by name even though they had never met, extended her hand with the formal courtesy reserved for meeting someone of significant accomplishment. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," General Hawkins said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional recognition. "On behalf of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I want to express our appreciation for your exceptional service today. What you accomplished represents not just successful mission completion, but validation of capabilities that we had assumed were lost to history." Elena accepted the general's handshake while struggling to process the magnitude of recognition she was receiving from command authority she had never expected to encounter. "Thank you, ma'am. I was simply using techniques that my grandfather developed and equipment that he maintained. The success belongs to his legacy more than to my individual performance." General Hawkins smiled with the appreciation of someone who understood both humility and the importance of preserving institutional knowledge. "Staff Sergeant, your grandfather developed remarkable techniques, but you've proven that those capabilities can be successfully transferred and employed under modern operational conditions. That represents an achievement that extends far beyond individual marksmanship." Elena found herself surrounded by a crowd of personnel who wanted to examine her grandfather's rifle, each person bringing specialized knowledge that added to her understanding of what Miguel had accomplished. Weapons specialists marveled at modifications that predated modern innovations by decades, while ballistics experts studied ammunition that achieved performance they had believed impossible with 1940s technology. Master Sergeant Bradley, who had initiated the morning's revelations about Operation Longbow, approached with a folder containing documents that Elena recognized as official military paperwork. "Staff Sergeant, I have authorization orders assigning you to a special projects unit that's being established specifically to preserve and develop the techniques your grandfather pioneered. Your success today has convinced command authority that these capabilities are too valuable to remain with a single individual." Elena opened the folder, reading assignment orders that would fundamentally change her military career while ensuring that Miguel's knowledge would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. "You want me to teach other soldiers to use my grandfather's methods?" Torres answered with enthusiasm that reflected the excitement of military professionals who had witnessed the successful employment of revolutionary techniques. "Ma'am, what you've demonstrated today represents capabilities that could transform special operations doctrine. The ability to achieve precision elimination at ranges exceeding conventional limits, using equipment and methods that don't depend on advanced technology, provides tactical options that no current military possesses." Elena looked around at the assembled personnel, understanding that her decision to compete in a shooting competition had accidentally revealed capabilities that would influence military planning and training for years to come. The morning had begun with other soldiers mocking her antiquated equipment. It was ending with senior command authority requesting that she share Miguel's techniques with the next generation of marksmen. Williams approached with information that provided context for the institutional interest in Elena's capabilities. "Staff Sergeant, preliminary analysis suggests that there are at least 47 documented scenarios over the past decade where conventional military assets couldn't achieve required precision due to range limitations or environmental factors. Your grandfather's techniques could have provided solutions for missions that were considered impossible." Elena realized that accepting the assignment would mean not just teaching Miguel's methods, but becoming responsible for ensuring that his innovations continued to save lives in situations that hadn't yet developed. She would be preserving knowledge that could prevent future tragedies, while honoring the memory of a man who had never sought recognition for his extraordinary contributions. General Hawkins stepped forward with final recognition that validated both Elena's performance and Miguel's legacy. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, your grandfather's service was classified for reasons that made public recognition impossible during his lifetime. Today's mission allows us to acknowledge that Miguel Vasquez developed capabilities that represent some of the most significant innovations in precision shooting in military history. Your success ensures that his contributions will finally receive the recognition they deserve. Elena looked down at the Springfield, understanding that she held not just a family heirloom, but a bridge between past innovation and future possibility. Miguel's quiet genius had found new expression through her hands, proving that some knowledge transcends the individuals who create it and continues to serve humanity across generations. The recognition she was receiving felt both earned and overwhelming. Validating years of training while creating responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. 6 months later, Elena stood at the front of a specialized classroom at the newly established Vasquez Precision Shooting Institute, watching 12 carefully selected military marksmen examine Springfield rifles that had been painstakingly restored to match her grandfather's specifications. Each weapon represented months of research and craftsmanship, as military armorers worked to recreate modifications that Miguel had developed 8 decades earlier using techniques that had been lost to history. The students represented the elite of American military marksmanship: snipers from Army Special Forces, Marine Scout snipers, Navy SEAL teams, and Air Force Special Operations Command. Each had been selected not just for exceptional shooting ability, but for the intellectual curiosity and patience required to master techniques that couldn't be learned through conventional training methods. They had volunteered for a program that promised to teach them capabilities that existed nowhere else in the military, but which required abandoning much of what they thought they knew about precision shooting. Elena moved among the students as they familiarized themselves with rifles that seemed primitive compared to the advanced systems they normally used, watching their expressions shift from skepticism to growing respect as they discovered the subtle sophistication built into Miguel's designs. "The modifications your grandfather made to these weapons," said Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a Marine sniper with 3 combat deployments, "they're not just improvements to existing systems. They represent a completely different philosophy of how precision shooting should work." Elena nodded, remembering her own journey from dismissing the Springfield as an antique to understanding it as the product of revolutionary thinking that had been ahead of its time. "My grandfather believed that the weapon should be an extension of the shooter rather than a technological solution to shooting problems. Every modification he made was designed to enhance human capability rather than replace human judgment." The ammunition laboratory adjacent to the classroom had become a center of innovation as military researchers worked to recreate Miguel's hand-loading techniques using modern components and quality control methods. Elena spent hours each day teaching students to load cartridges according to specifications that combined 1940s wisdom with 21st century precision manufacturing, creating ammunition that achieved performance levels that commercial manufacturers couldn't replicate. Master Sergeant Kevin Chun, a Special Forces sniper with extensive combat experience, held up one of Miguel's custom cartridges with the reverence usually reserved for rare artifacts. "Staff Sergeant, I've been reloading ammunition for 15 years, and I've never seen formulations this sophisticated. The powder charges are measured to tolerances that require laboratory equipment, but the component combinations include elements that aren't in any modern reloading manual." Elena demonstrated the loading process using equipment that bridged 8 decades of technological development, combining Miguel's handwritten formulas with digital scales and computer-controlled powder dispensers. "My grandfather developed these loads through thousands of hours of testing under conditions that most modern shooters never encounter. He wasn't just creating accurate ammunition. He was designing cartridges optimized for specific environmental factors and tactical requirements. The training program had attracted attention from unexpected sources as word of its success spread through military and law enforcement communities. Representatives from allied nations had requested access to the curriculum, while civilian marksmanship organizations sought permission to study techniques that had achieved legendary status among those who understood their significance. Elena found herself at the center of international interest in capabilities that she had inherited almost by accident. Colonel Morrison, who had been instrumental in establishing the program, approached with documentation that showed the expanding impact of Miguel's techniques beyond their original military applications. Staff Sergeant, we've received requests from law enforcement agencies in 43 states for training in ultra-long-range precision shooting. The Las Vegas hostage rescue demonstrated capabilities that police departments need for situations that conventional SWAT training can't address. Elena reviewed training requests that ranged from urban police departments dealing with barricaded suspects to federal agencies requiring precision shooting in challenging environmental conditions. Each request represented situations where Miguel's techniques could save lives by providing solutions that modern equipment and training couldn't achieve. The program was growing beyond anything she had anticipated when she first accepted assignment to preserve her grandfather's knowledge. The rifle range where students practiced had been modified to accommodate training scenarios that replicated the extreme conditions under which Miguel had developed his techniques. Wind machines created variable crosswinds, thermal generators produced atmospheric distortions, and adjustable target systems allowed practice at ranges extending beyond 1,500 yards. Elena watched her students struggle with environmental challenges that required intuitive understanding rather than technological solutions. Lieutenant Sarah Williams, a Navy SEAL sniper who had initially been skeptical about abandoning modern equipment, achieved her first successful hit at 1,200 yards using Miguel's techniques and immediately understood what Elena had been trying to teach. "It's not just about the rifle or the ammunition," Williams said, her voice carrying the excitement of discovery. "It's about developing sensory awareness that lets you read conditions that instruments can't measure." Elena smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher watching students grasp concepts that couldn't be explained through lectures alone. "My grandfather used to say that precision shooting at extreme ranges was like playing a musical instrument. The mechanical techniques were just the beginning. The real skill came from developing sensitivity that allowed you to perform beyond what the equipment specifications suggested was possible." The success of student training had led to operational deployments where Miguel's techniques proved their value under combat conditions. Elena received regular reports from graduates who had used their training to accomplish missions that conventional methods couldn't address. Each success adding to the validated effectiveness of techniques that had been preserved through family inheritance rather than institutional documentation. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, who had been part of the original team that discovered Elena's rifle, approached with news that represented the program's ultimate validation. "Staff Sergeant, I've just received confirmation that Operation Longbow has been declassified for historical research purposes. Your grandfather's service record is being released to military historians, and his contributions will finally receive the public recognition they deserve." Elena felt a mixture of pride and sadness as she realized that Miguel's preference for privacy about his achievements had finally been overruled by historical necessity. He never wanted attention for what he'd accomplished. "I think he would have preferred that his techniques be recognized rather than his individual service." The declassification had revealed details about Miguel's wartime operations that exceeded even Elena's growing understanding of his capabilities. Intelligence records documented 247 confirmed eliminations at ranges exceeding 800 yards, including missions where his precision shooting had prevented enemy operations that could have cost thousands of Allied lives. Military historians were calling him one of the most effective individual combatants in American military history. General Hawkins arrived for the program's 6-month evaluation with news that would fundamentally change Elena's understanding of her grandfather's continuing influence. Staff Sergeant, analysis of recent special operations missions shows that graduates of your training program have achieved success rates in precision shooting missions that exceed previous benchmarks by significant margins. Miguel Vasquez's techniques aren't just historically interesting, they're operationally superior to current military doctrine. Elena found herself looking at her grandfather's portrait, which now occupied a place of honor in the Institute's main corridor, wondering whether he had ever imagined that his innovations would someday influence military training programs around the world. The quiet man who had taught her to shoot tin cans in the New Mexico desert had become the foundation for capabilities that were reshaping how modern military forces approached impossible missions. The original Springfield that had started Elena's journey remained in active use as a training instrument, its 8-decade-old mechanism still functioning with the reliability that Miguel had built into every component. Students competed for the privilege of firing the rifle that had achieved legendary status, understanding that they were using the actual weapon that had proven the effectiveness of techniques they were learning to master. Elena's final class of the day consisted of senior officers from multiple branches of the military, each learning Miguel's environmental reading methods that allowed precision shooting under conditions that defeated technological solutions. She watched colonels and generals struggle with concepts that required abandoning reliance on instruments in favor of sensory awareness that took months to develop. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, Elena stood on the range where her journey had begun, holding her grandfather's rifle and reflecting on how completely her life had changed since that morning when other snipers had mocked her antiquated equipment. The Springfield felt familiar and comfortable in her hands, its weight representing not just personal inheritance, but responsibility for preserving knowledge that continued to save lives in situations Miguel could never have anticipated. The program had grown beyond training individual marksmen to influencing military doctrine, law enforcement procedures, and international cooperation in precision shooting techniques. Elena had become not just the keeper of her grandfather's legacy, but the bridge between past innovation and future possibility, ensuring that Miguel's genius would continue serving humanity for generations to come. In the distance, she could hear the sound of students practicing on the range, their rifles echoing across the desert as they learned to achieve the impossible using techniques that had once been dismissed as obsolete, but had proven to be timeless. 2 years after establishing the Vasquez Precision Shooting Institute, Elena received an emergency call that would test whether her grandfather's techniques could be successfully transferred to others under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. She was reviewing training schedules in her office when Colonel Morrison burst through the door with the kind of urgency that instantly communicated crisis-level developments requiring immediate attention. Elena, we have a situation in Yemen that requires immediate deployment of longbow-trained personnel, Morrison said, his voice carrying the tension that preceded major operations. A Navy SEAL reconnaissance team has been compromised deep in hostile territory, and conventional rescue options have been ruled out due to terrain and enemy positioning that makes standard extraction impossible. Elena looked up from her paperwork, immediately recognizing the tone and terminology that indicated her students were about to face their first operational test of Miguel's techniques under combat conditions that would determine whether the training program had successfully preserved capabilities that existed nowhere else in the military. What's the tactical situation? Morrison spread aerial photographs across Elena's desk, revealing terrain that looked like a nightmare scenario designed to test every principle that Miguel had developed for ultra-long-range precision shooting. 4 SEALs are pinned down in a canyon system that's too narrow for helicopter extraction and too well defended for ground assault. Enemy forces have positioned themselves on ridgelines that provide overlapping fields of fire on any approach route. Elena studied the photographs with growing recognition of tactical challenges that aligned almost perfectly with scenarios described in her grandfather's logbook, understanding that this situation would require not just exceptional marksmanship, but the kind of environmental reading and tactical judgment that Miguel had spent years developing. What's the maximum range for potential shooting positions? 1,437 yards from the closest position that offers both concealment and clear sight lines to enemy positions, Morrison replied, pointing to elevation markers. That indicated the extreme range would test every aspect of the training her students had received. Weather conditions include variable winds, thermal distortion from desert heating, and atmospheric pressure changes that make precision shooting extremely challenging. Elena felt the familiar mixture of pride and apprehension that came with knowing her grandfather's techniques were about to be tested under conditions that would validate or disprove everything she had been teaching for the past 2 years. Which of my graduates are available for immediate deployment? Morrison consulted his tablet computer, reviewing personnel assignments and readiness status with the efficiency of someone coordinating complex military operations under time pressure. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos from the Marine Program and Master Sergeant Kevin Chun from Special Forces are currently on standby status. Both have completed advanced training in your grandfather's techniques and have demonstrated consistent accuracy at ranges exceeding 1,400 yards. Elena nodded with satisfaction, remembering both students as exceptional marksmen who had embraced Miguel's methods with the dedication required to master techniques that couldn't be learned through conventional training approaches. Santos had achieved remarkable consistency with environmental reading methods, while Chun had demonstrated intuitive understanding of the ammunition optimization principles that made extreme range shooting possible. I want to deploy with them, Elena said, recognizing that this mission would provide crucial validation of whether Miguel's techniques could be successfully transferred to operational personnel who hadn't inherited his knowledge through family connection. This is the first real test of whether the training program has preserved capabilities that can be employed by others. Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of deploying Elena in a combat zone where her unique knowledge could be lost if the mission failed. Elena, you're too valuable to risk an operational deployment. If something goes wrong, we lose the only person who fully understands your grandfather's complete system of techniques. Elena understood Morrison's concern, but she also recognized that her presence might be essential for ensuring mission success under conditions that would challenge even her most capable students. Colonel, Santos and Chun are excellent marksmen, but they're about to attempt something that only 3 people in history have successfully accomplished. They need support from someone who has operational experience with these techniques. The deployment preparation took place with the controlled urgency that characterized special operations, missions where lives depended on perfect execution under challenging conditions. Elena worked with Santos and Chun to analyze environmental data from the target area, comparing current conditions to similar scenarios documented in Miguel's logbook while preparing ammunition optimized for the specific atmospheric factors they would encounter. Santos had been selected not just for her marksmanship ability, but for her exceptional skills in reading environmental conditions that affected bullet trajectory at extreme ranges. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, the thermal patterns shown in satellite imagery are similar to conditions your grandfather documented during operations in North Africa. The temperature gradients will create mirage effects that could make target identification challenging. Elena nodded, remembering Miguel's detailed notes about shooting in desert environments where heat distortion could make targets appear to shift position even when viewed through high-quality optics. That's why he developed the scanning techniques we practiced during advanced training. You'll need to use multiple observation points to triangulate actual target positions through the thermal distortion. Chun had been working with the ammunition that Elena had prepared according to Miguel's specifications for extreme range, shooting under challenging atmospheric conditions. The powder charges are significantly different from standard military loads, he observed, examining cartridges that had been hand-assembled using formulations that bridged 8 decades of ballistics development. The pressure curves are optimized for maintaining consistent velocity despite temperature variations. Elena demonstrated the loading techniques that Miguel had developed for ensuring consistent performance under conditions where small variations in ammunition could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Every cartridge has to be perfect because you won't have opportunities for ranging shots or trajectory adjustment. The first shot has to eliminate the target, and subsequent shots have to follow immediately with the same precision. The flight to the operational area provided Elena with time to review tactical plans while monitoring real-time intelligence updates about the trapped SEAL team's condition. The 4 operators had been conducting reconnaissance on terrorist training facilities when their position was compromised by local informants, forcing them to take defensive positions in terrain that offered protection but no escape routes. Elena studied current photographs of the target area, noting enemy positions that had established overlapping fields of fire, covering all conventional approach routes while maintaining communication with commanders who could call in reinforcements if attacked. The terrorist positioning shows sophisticated tactical understanding, she observed. They've created a situation where any conventional rescue attempt would result in both rescuer and SEAL casualties. Santos and Chun spent the flight time reviewing environmental data and adjusting their equipment according to real-time atmospheric conditions that would affect their shooting once they reached the operational area. Both marksmen understood that they were about to attempt something that existed at the absolute limits of human capability, using techniques that had been proven successful only under historical conditions that might not translate perfectly to current circumstances. The helicopter approached the designated firing position as Elena felt the familiar tension that preceded operations where success depended on capabilities that existed nowhere else in the military arsenal. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the canyon system where 4 American operators were depending on techniques developed by her grandfather to save them from certain death or capture. Elena checked her equipment one final time, understanding that she was about to witness the ultimate test of whether Miguel's innovations could be transferred to others and employed successfully under the kind of extreme conditions that had originally necessitated their development. Santos and Chun represented not just her teaching ability, but the continuation of capabilities that had taken her grandfather a lifetime to perfect. The mission would determine whether the Vasquez Precision Shooting Institute had successfully preserved knowledge that could continue saving American lives in impossible situations, or whether Miguel's techniques were so specialized that they could only be employed by those who had inherited his understanding through direct family connection rather than institutional training. The mission unfolded with precision that would have made Miguel proud. Santos and Chun positioned themselves at the extreme range, their movements reflecting months of training and techniques that few people alive could execute. Elena watched through binoculars as both marksmen settled into firing positions, their breathing synchronized with principles her grandfather had developed 8 decades earlier. Santos fired first, her shot eliminating the enemy commander at 1,437 yards with accuracy that validated every hour of training Elena had provided. Chun's follow-up shots neutralized the remaining threats within seconds, creating the opening that allowed helicopter extraction of all 4 SEALs without casualties. "Targets eliminated," Santos reported, her voice steady despite having just accomplished something that military historians would study for decades. "All friendly personnel are secure." Elena felt overwhelming pride as she realized that Miguel's legacy had transcended family inheritance to become institutional capability that would continue saving lives long after she was gone. Her grandfather's techniques hadn't just survived. They had evolved into teachable doctrine that could be passed to future generations of marksmen. 2 hours later, as the rescued SEALs thanked their saviors, Elena understood that she had witnessed the true success of the training program. Santos and Chun had proven that extraordinary capabilities could be transferred through dedicated instruction and practice, ensuring that Miguel's innovations would continue serving those who needed them most. The quiet man who had never sought recognition for his achievements had become the foundation for a legacy that would echo through military history, saving American lives in impossible situations that hadn't even been imagined when he first modified that Springfield rifle in 1944. What did you think of Elena's incredible journey from mocked competitor to guardian of legendary techniques? If stories of hidden family legacies and extraordinary courage inspire you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts about Miguel's amazing legacy in the comments below. We love hearing from our incredible community of viewers from around the world.